Labor Travail, which we all know. And his most recent book with Larry Savage is titled Unions in Court, Organized Labor, and the Charter of Rights and Freedoms.
Thanks, everyone. Just comes up here. Windows is so percent. Well, thanks everyone for coming on this last day. I'd like to thank the organizers of this conference. It's been fantastic, and I've learned so much. Jim was telling me that one of the reasons they chose these halls is because the seats you're sitting in, based on their comfort level, are actually from 1919. So after hitting the 1890s. And just before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we're in Treaty 1 territory, and thanks, Jens, for teaching me this yesterday. The lands of Anishinaabe Cree, Oji Cree, and Dene peoples in the homeland of the Métis. So thank you for doing that. So this paper comes out of all of the sort of work that's come out of the Winnipeg General Strike over the last couple of years. And in particular, and I just wanted to say that that picture on the left, on my left, is not from Winnipeg, it's from Estevan. I thought we needed some Prairie content that wasn't just based on Winnipeg. Because everyone I've met here at the conferences, I was born in Winnipeg. So I wasn't born in Winnipeg, and I lived in Saskatchewan. So I thought I'd just bring some Saskatchewan content. But I am going to talk a little bit about the Winnipeg General Strike. So in many ways, this strike is an important event, not just for understanding working class struggle in Canada, but also for thinking through how the strike radicalized a whole generation of workers throughout the 1920s and 40s, and whose legacy and the institutions they were able to build, I think still resonates today and still influences worker struggles today. So the paper begins, and it's actually inspired by Jim's Naylor's work, and his engagement with what he describes broadly in his recent book as labor socialists. And I guess if I want to draw a line between Winnipeg and labor socialism, we don't have to look much further than independent Labour Party members and MPs, and we can look at some of that leadership like Woodsworth or Ivins or others. These actual socialist activists, if we read their papers closely, were clearly radicalized by 1919 and fought for a socialist future throughout the 1920s and 30s. So labor historians and political scientists, and sometimes lazily, I think, and no one in this room would fall into that category, but argue that the left itself kind of fragmented after 1919 and broadly fragmented into one of two broad camps, or the socialist and communist organizations. I'm not going to get too much into that today, but the truth is that a host of labor socialists, whether they were in what became the Communist Party or what became the CCF or other socialist organizations, saw as part of their goal a way to capture and transform the state. And I am a political scientist at heart, so you'll have to forgive me for that. I'm sorry about that. But so that the brutal repression of workers that happened in Winnipeg would become a thing of the past. And one of the other goals, which goes hand in hand, I think, with that transformation, that's been talked about on this panel, is to alter how the ruling classes rule through the state, and ultimately they don't rule through the state, but how the bourgeoisie can use the iron hand of the police and the police charge, which is so on display in Winnipeg, and then the law itself, right? Not just the police side of the law, but the courts, the judicial system, the legal apparatus of the state, as a weapon against workers. And of course, we saw that in this criminal show, and I have in my notes, Trials, led by J.J. Andrews, and then made so famous as an act of resistance by Bill Pritchard's now famous speech in the jury, and that would become a thing in the past. And the fact that the leaders of the strike had to run for office from jail for essentially acting in defiance of the law. I think many labor socialists saw that as a big problem and wanted to change it or eradicate those conditions. So this leads to a 25-year struggle between capital, labor, and the state, and this is why I'm not a historian, because I'm a political scientist, so I can easily jump through 30 years of history and just ignore that. My students accept that, historians do not. And the state to rethink how socialists would relate and use the state to promote workers' rights. And that brings me, and this is my leap of faith in some ways, to throw a throwback to the social gospel of so many of the leaders of this thing, to bring me the Saskatchewan Trade Union Act in 1944. So forgive me for that leap. The act itself has become a central component of Saskatchewan history. It was the first to recognize the bona fide rights of workers to collectively bargain in that jurisdiction. It was also the first to recognize the rights of workers to organize legally. And yet, surprisingly, the act itself has not been given rigorous scholarly attention. And I think This is true for a couple of reasons. And these are questions that I'm still working through. This is a work in progress, so in the Q&A I'd really be interested in your thoughts, and if you have any suggestions for sources or for ways to go, I'd really appreciate that. So the act was passed at the same time as the federal government introduced PC 1003, or at least right around the same time. So I think some of the reasons why the act gets ignored is because one, it's in Saskatchewan, and as I've learned living in Saskatchewan for a decade, what happens in Saskatchewan doesn't tend to leave Saskatchewan very much. And of course it was sort of overshadowed by the federal government's wartime order of PC 1003, which of course we all know about, which for the first time recognized sort of similar rights, but there are differences, and I'm going to get into that. Although there were important differences, and I think the lack of scholarly attention raises important questions that we as socialists or as labor activists need to think through. Was the CCF government a party that clearly identified as socialist? Whether or not we disagree with that or not is another question. You know, sometimes we call them social democratic, sometimes we call them socialist. I'm not too concerned about that, but they certainly identify as socialists, and they, in all their letters and all their promotion, that's what they called themselves. Was the CCF government radically different from the federal Liberal Party's labor policies? And what's interesting is it was different, but I think we got to look at, well, was it radically different? So why did they embrace the same type of model in some ways as the federal Liberals were doing at the same time? And as my friend and colleague David Camfield noted in his presentation on Thursday, the Winnipeg General Strikers, and he said this, I think I'm quoting him right, was, "We're not fighting for PC 1003. And sure, that's probably true, and I'm still trying to think about this. Many of the labor socialists in the 1920s and between 1920s and 1940s certainly warmed to the idea of industrial legality as a way to promote the rights of labor and to avoid what happened in Winnipeg in 1919. And that's interesting to think through both the tensions and problems that emerge with industrial legality, but also the benefits and how we think through how socialists relate to labor when they form power. So one of the questions that's at the center of this project is what made the Saskatchewan CCF's labor code socialist, in as much as the code was designed as a model, not just for Saskatchewan, and this is true, I think the research is pretty clear on this, and the Liberals in Saskatchewan always accused the CCF of constructing an act that was clearly designed for Ontario, and Tommy Douglas and his cabinet said, no, we would never, that's not what we care about Saskatchewan, but it's pretty clear. It was designed specifically for Ontario. So it's a model for CCF parties in other provinces. Why did Saskatchewan CCF feel the need to bring in a far-reaching labor code to begin with, given that it was largely an agricultural community, had a really small industrial working class? What was the point of the act itself, given that it just didn't have a lot of workers to protect? Second, why did the Saskatchewan CCF's labor code, what did it offer to workers that couldn't be offered to workers by other parties? Was the code a model for other jurisdictions? Was it tailored to Saskatchewan for a very specific reason? Third, what does the code tell us about the relationship between the left, socialists, and particularly the relationship between socialists and the unions? And what might this history tell us about the next generation of labor and political activism that would promote similar far-reaching labor code, or not, right? There were some interesting papers yesterday about, called brand cuff, the limitations of industrial law, or labor law, and how it delegitimizes or takes away this promotion of labor struggle. So maybe a future socialist world would not have industrial legality or labor law as we know it today. And again, I'm still thinking through some of these ideas. And what would that look like to address today's workplace challenges? Okay, so those are the broad questions, looking over the idea of the boundaries of the strike weapon and examining sort of that history. So let me give you a bit of a picture of the bill, and then I think that'll give you some ideas of some of the problems and issues that I'm grappling with. So you all know that the CCF was elected in 1944. It's seen as a major breakthrough for the party, both in Saskatchewan but at the national level. The national party is pretty excited that this could be a wave of socialist governments taking power. Of course, it wasn't. But how could the Saskatchewan victory help the CCF was the big question of the National Party, jurisdictions, particularly in British Columbia, in Ontario, and at the federal level. And this was a particularly important question to the CCF because its relationship with the labor movement had always been sort of tenuous. One of the CCF's, of course, major growth plans was to seek greater union affiliation with the CCL unions, which actually never really occurs. So one of the first actions of the CCF, in fact, when they get elected, I think it's Bill 3, they create the Department of Labor. It didn't exist before. They create a bureaucracy to sort of administer what becomes the new Labour Relations Act and a host of other things. The Minister of Labour, who was a bit of a strange guy, he wasn't very swift by all accounts. There's some really nasty letters from his deputies about how he doesn't really understand what he's doing. Apparently he was more interested in the telephone aspect of the Labour Department than he was in the Labour Department itself. He was also came out of Regina, he was a TLC guy in the railways. There was a guy named C.C. Williams, and there was always accusations that he was biased towards the TLC and didn't like the CCL unions very much, which I think is actually true. You can kind of see in his letters. They also created a standalone deputy minister for labour, which becomes, after some tensions with the unions, because the CCL unions wanted some of their own people in there, an economist from Ontario named Ken Brudd. So there's a lot of tensions about who the people are in these new institutions. But again, they're kind of making up as they go along. They don't know what they're doing, and they're trying to meander through this new rule. The Trade Union Act itself, I think, was Bill 30, or it was one of the first things we did, and which I think speaks to its importance. When we look at it, we break it down, it's interesting because the Trade Union Act becomes very similar, or looks very similar, and they take as their inspiration, clearly, the National Labor Relations Act in the United States from 1933, or the Wagner Act, as it's well known. Douglas's government drafted a bill that adopted most of the provisions of the NLRA. And interestingly, it mentioned that had been previously adopted and was going through the process in Ottawa, which with PC 1003. Now, that all is true, but here's some differences that are interesting to think about. And I think if a government today were to put some of these issues on the table, they would be accused of being radical communists. And I'll be interested in your thoughts on this. So, first thing they did, and this was different than anywhere else in the country, is they allowed public sector workers to strike and to unionize. And that had not happened anywhere else. And it didn't happen anywhere else until the 1960s at the federal level, and in some provinces, like in Ontario, it takes much longer. And in some ways, this becomes a problem for the government, because as soon as they give public sector unions these rights, the public sector workers say, great, let's use them, and we want to bargain. Oh, by the way, we'd like some wage increases. We haven't had that in 15 years of the Depression. And Doug says, wait a second, we gave you the act. What more do you want from us? I mean, we don't have any money. It was back crop year. Like, there's this non-stop tension between 1944 and 1960, 2 or 3, whenever they're elected out. To put that in perspective, those same rights would not be granted to federal public servants until 67, and later in other provinces in the 80s. So the 44 and 45 Act was a forward-looking bill in some ways. Why would labor legislation in some ways be given a priority for a government that was governing in a primarily agricultural-based society economy? And it's interesting because when they do fight with the unions, at some point Douglas will write back, and they're always going back and forth with the people in Ottawa. It's like, listen, we don't really need labor. Right? They can squawk all they want and use those words squawk, or they're sometimes accused of being communist, and probably they were in some of the unions. But you'd say, listen, at the end of the day, we don't need them. Right? They can strike and they can not vote for us, and we'll win because we've got the farmers. And in Saskatchewan, that mattered. Still does, unfortunately, because none of the conservatives. But the bill itself was actually not drafted by the Douglas cabinet, which is also really interesting because most of the CCF in Saskatchewan, they were really sort of cautious about this. Most of their expertise came from inside the party in Saskatchewan because Saskatchewan people would notice if there was a lot of technocrats coming in from somewhere else. The act itself is not drafted by anyone in Saskatchewan. They fly in 2 CCF labor lawyers, a guy named Andrew Bruin, who was president of the CCF. He actually wrote the act. I've got multiple drafts that he wrote. And Ted Jolliffe, who becomes the leader of the Ontario CCF. And in the background is always the hand of David Lewis. That guy controlled everything in the party, and him and Douglas were back and forth all the time. And of course, and just to Leonor Christo, Pat Conroy and Aaron Mosher are constantly consulted about what the act will look like. And then the act becomes sort of law pretty quickly in 1945. Given that, I found this in the archive, and I thought it was really funny. I'm not using the slides as much as some of my co-presenters, but after the act is drafted, so this is a campaign from 1948, right around the federal election, for the CCL, which was adopted by the CCF at the national level. I want to introduce you to a Saskatchewan kid named Labor Louie. Labor Louie becomes part of the CCF campaign to adopt labor rights and as a key promotional tool for workers, primarily, but not exclusively, in Ontario. So look what you've got in Saskatchewan. We can now get those same things in Ontario. And the CCF and the CCL combined with this cartoon, Labor Louie, to take you on a march through the labor rights of other jurisdictions in Canada, and you find out how terrible it is everywhere else but in the bright, sunny place of Saskatchewan. So I know some of that fine print is kind of hard to read. It's probably a digital camera reconstruction of the actual paper. But Louis goes through all the different jurisdictions and how horrible it is in Alberta, how horrible it is in British Columbia, etc. Finds out that, well, actually, it's actually really good in Saskatchewan. You have certified collective bargaining. You see on the left, or on the right there in the second panel down, look at how nice and happy we are dealing with our capitalists in Saskatchewan. We all sit around the table and talk. Labor Louis gets lots of time off and vacation and a 44-hour work week. The unions wanted a 40-hour work week, like the CCF would give it to them. All that to say, everything's great in Saskatchewan. Come to Saskatchewan, we have Labor Louis. And I thought that was kind of an interesting cartoon. So, the Douglas government, I believe, was also interested in a project that came to the conclusion, perhaps even reluctantly, and I'm actually convinced there was a lot of opposition. His finance minister, a guy named C.F. Fines, was pretty clearly hostile to collective bargaining, as was some of his more progressive farmer activists in the party. But they wanted to promote, because any socialist party worth their salt, I think they thought, had to promote, regardless of how many workers were in their jurisdiction, had to promote collective bargaining, had to create a legal framework to organize, including mandating that employers recognize a legally certified bargaining representative and a legal right to strike, and that it would be administered not by the courts, right, by the Court of King's Bench, and that we all remember what the King's Bench was. We've had a king for too long. Why would we have more retired? No, it isn't. But it would be a labor relations board, and the board would be staffed not by lawyers, but by labor experts, right? The first chair of the board is Ken Bright, the deputy minister, who is very close to the party and a CCF member, which today would be seen as a problem, but not in the 1940s. The bill also had several recognizable features that were interesting. Section 4, for instance, took a clear stand against company unionism, and there was a significant difference between the CCF's bill and the 44 and PC 103. It was that they clearly outlawed company unionism. And there's some great work that's been done on organizing the book called Labor's War, where they talk about anti-unionism in that period. And it's interesting to think about the strikebreaker as someone who will bust heads to form a union and people get fired. But during the war, they couldn't do that because there was labor shortages, and actually it was really hard to fire people during the war, and I was learning in that book. So one of the major forms of anti-unionism in the 40s was not firing people and busting heads, it was forming company unions. So that the unions take a really strong stance that we have to outlaw these organizations. So they make it clearly illegal in Saskatchewan. It's more ambiguous in PC 103. Like, it's not clearly outlawed, and that was a big critique. The bill created the board, which was given real teeth. It had the ability to make orders, and then use the courts to sort of impose those orders, or to make those orders have some teeth, versus some of the labor boards that were constructed by Ottawa. The list of unfair labor practices is really interesting. First off, there was no unfair labor practices that unions could do. Unions couldn't have unfair, because the argument was, unions have no advantages in bargaining, employers have all the advantages, so only employers can create unfair labor practices. So there's no list of unfair labor practices that unions can actually do. Employers couldn't threaten employees or fire them during union drives or activity. Employers couldn't threaten to move operations to avoid union organizing. Numerous and extensive penalties for engaging in unfair labor practices that again only apply to employers. Section 13 of the Act gave this is, I think, the most radical component. Section 13 of the Act gave the Cabinet and Lieutenant Governor and Council the power to appoint a controller to essentially take control of a private business who, quote, has willfully disregarded or disobeyed, any order filed by the board. In other words, the Cabinet can take over a private business and make it a corporation if they refuse to bargain in good faith, which I think is pretty radical, and I made that proposal to the NDP Council that they should just re-adopt Section 13 of the 1944 Act in there, and I was looked at, was like, wait, you're looking at me now. Like, yeah, are you insane? Conciliation, it was not mandatory, and conciliation often is that sort of model that tries to avoid strikes. Like, don't go strike, we can talk about it, we'll bring in an expert, we'll mediate you. That was mandatory in every other jurisdiction, but in Saskatchewan, it was only available if both parties agreed to it, and Labour had the capacity not to agree to it. The Act legalized mandatory dues collection and maintenance membership provision, which is a much more strict form of union security than the RAND formula. The RAND formula is a bit more ambiguous on union security. Maintenance membership is much more strict and gives unions much more power, since you had to join the union if you wanted to work. And they actually get in trouble at CCF because they want to get rid of that in the 50s because employers oppose it so much. and the national party, the national unions get really mad when the CCF says they're going to take it away. Every employee this is the Union Security Clause, every employee who is now or hereafter becomes a member of the union shall maintain his membership in the union as a condition of his employment. All the gendered language is hid. That's another criticism we're working through. There's almost no provisions for women. They don't see women as workers in this act. It's a real problem. New units could be determined just by a 50% card declaration for the board. And if you didn't have 50%, you could get 25% and then you would have a vote. 25% is a pretty low threshold. I think today to get a vote, you have to have over 50%. So it's pretty wide open. So the implications, and I'm almost done, I'll conclude on this, I think I'm running out of time. The bill opens a flood of organizing in Saskatchewan, and unionization increases rapidly between 1944 and 1956. And it actually levels off after that. So you can just kind of see, I just did this last night. I was sort of thinking, I like graphs, and I know historians don't like quantitative stuff, so I think I'm going to throw in a graph just to show you that I'm not a historian and I'm a quantitative scientist. But you just see the steady increase. And that continues to about the mid-50s, and then it sort of levels off and takes off again in the 1970s. But it's not surprising that this happened so quickly, because one, the board is sympathetic, and two, the public servants unionize like crazy. And that's really the increase. If you look at the list, and the Department of Labor has some pretty good information about this. As you see them organizing in hospitals, in mental health institutions, and a host of other places, and all the crowns get unionized in this period. The real prize for the unions was the civil service, and there's a lot of fighting over that. And Douglas was trying to navigate that as cabinet and not doing it very effectively. What's interesting, though, and this is where I'm going to conclude, is that as the act takes hold, legality becomes actually a weapon for the government. When talks break down between the power workers and the government in 1950 and again 1955, the government repeatedly threatens compulsory arbitration, which today would be mandatory arbitration, as a form of back-to-work legislation. So they become aggressively using the act against their own civil servants to sort of limit labor strike. Douglas writes to Lorne Ingle, the National Secretary in 55, there isn't much use in wearying you with the details of our negotiations with the power workers. Yesterday, I met the negotiating committee and asked them to accept voluntary arbitration, and they refused. Unless a settlement is in sight by the Wednesday, or the union in the meantime agree to a voluntary arbitration, we will probably give first reading to the anti-strike legislation on that day. In other words, when public servants became a problem, the CCF acted a lot like governments do today, and they were going to legislate it back. Between 44 and 50, Lewis is key to managing this relationship. Am I out of time? Okay. And he is the sort of bloodshed that sort of does this. And yeah. So labor legislation plays a contradiction for socialists in Saskatchewan. The act's a strange contradiction. It's a local act. It's designed for a national audience. It's designed as a document promoting the rights of unions, but becomes a tool to discipline labor when governments are under stress. So legality itself becomes a problem for socialism in Saskatchewan and the relationship between unions and